Hey guys, Mark Allen, BHSpringSolutions LLC and BHSpringSolutions.com, and it's mid-December 2019, and earlier this year the dual stage buffering recoil spring guide rod assembly from BHSpringSolutions became our #1 selling product. And here is an interesting thing that we noticed is this became our #1 selling product, and no kidding, in terms of units sold this year. And we have noticed, quite frankly, mixed reviews. And we started picking up on this very quickly after we started shipping the product in July of this year. We would see feedback from one purchaser, and his reaction was very positive. I notice a lot of difference in how much recoil and how much muzzle flip and how much energy I'm feeling in my hand when I shoot. And then we had other folks who wrote to us or called us and said, I just don't see a difference. And so this is a very interesting thing, but on behalf of my partner Slav and I, we're going to kind of eat crow on something here that we should have anticipated possibly and should have seen coming. And I don't think we did, and we're going to now make a change to this product. And because here's what we have noticed, and this has been 100% reliable as far as folks who have called on our toll-free line, and hey, I got the buffering guide rod, I got it put in, and and it's okay, it's functioning, everything's working okay, but I don't notice that much of a difference. And the common thread of all of these that are not appreciating or realizing the benefits of the buffering guide rod, the common thread is those that we have heard from who haven't noticed a difference, it seems are the ones who don't have all BHSpringSolutions springs throughout the rest of the high power pistol. And this change was prompted by the number of calls from friends, BH veterans who have purchased the buffering guide rod, who have told us, it seems like a good product and a good idea, but I just don't notice any difference in what I feel when I'm shooting. And then we find out that it's a 1967 Browning high power, and there's never been a spring changed in this handgun ever. And let me explain to you what that winds up looking like. That winds up looking like a recoil spring that's been in the high power since 1967 that doesn't look like this anymore. It will be much shorter. It will be allowing a lot more slide, the speed of the slide rearward. It actually kind of gives the recoil of the slide a jump start on the bullet, you might say. Because there's not enough resistance in the rearward slide velocity, and that's the job of the recoil spring, which is that size. Usually when a recoil spring is original, the main spring or the hammer spring, and that is the spring that creates the, as an example, when the slide starts back, the slide has to cock the hammer like this, and it's cocking the hammer against the resistance of the mainspring, and the mainspring is a spring this size. So without the buffering guide rod even being considered yet, your slide's rearward velocity is being controlled by two springs, and those springs are that big. And if these springs are not doing their job, or if these springs are original, or if these springs are, this is a Wolf and this is a OEM, or this, don't really know because I bought it from so-and-so and I don't really know what springs are in it. And ejecting empty shell casings or landing 16 feet away from the high power, which was the case with one gentleman we talked to. you are not going to notice any difference. In other words, two springs that are this size are already failing to control the slide's rearward velocity. A spring of this size, which is the spring inside the buffering recoil spring guide rod, that's not going to make up for what these two springs are not doing. Now, what we can say is very consistently, when we have helped our purchasers of the buffering guide rod with this information, and they have changed out the rest of the springs in their high power, and they've gotten the ejecting empty shell casing distance down into this sweet spot of 5 to 9 feet away from the high power. 7 to 8 feet is also very sweet. And now that rearward slide velocity is controlled. Now they start to be able to appreciate the difference. Now I'm going to explain to you the reason why for that. Lots of places on the internet, you can find them all over the place. You can see slow motion videos. These slow motion videos are the trigger being pulled and the slide starts rearward. And typically, right at the moment when you see the slide starting rearward, you start to see muzzle rise, typically. Now, this is all happening before this buffering recoil spring guide rod is even doing anything. The buffering recoil spring guide rod has a shock absorbing spring inside of it, and it looks like that. Now, this does not come into the equation at all until 3/8 of an inch before full rearward slide travel. I'm going to show you about what that looks like. Approximately back to right there, I start to feel the buffer in the guide rod, and then the rest of the way back is against the buffering guide rod spring and the recoil spring to finish off the rearward slide travel. Now, the point in this is, when you watch any of these slow motion videos that show the muzzle rise at the moment when that slide starts rearward, you start to see muzzle rise. The buffering guide rod has no play in this part. You already see muzzle rise. This must be controlled by the proper springs. And the proper springs, the best way to go about this is a BHSpringSolutions complete recoil spring, or a complete optimized spring kit for your Browning high power or your high power clone. That's the best place to start first, before even a buffering guide rod. And if you have a buffering guide rod and you've not installed all BHSpringSolutions springs, it's really important to do that in order to get the benefit out of the buffering guide rod. So anyway, back to the explanation here. So now we have the correct recoil spring, we have the correct mainspring, we have the correct resistance when the slide starts rearward and the muzzle starts to rise. There's a point in the rearward slide travel where the slide stops. I call it the collision, and that is that metal to metal click sound. Now, I had to really horse this slide just now in order to get that click to be so pronounced. When I get back to about this point, everything becomes very, very resistant. I can still get the click. The slide needs to make its full rearward motion. But just before that collision of the slide and the frame, there's additional buffering. Now that's significant because when you go back and look at any of these slow motion videos of the weapon is fired, the slide starts rearward, and the muzzle starts to rise, at the very back of recoil where you see or hear or you see in the slow motion video that collision, where the slide and the frame, the slide is back as far as it can possibly go. The slide and the frame have collided. Now the slide's going to start back forward. At that collision point, there is a typical muzzle jump or muzzle flip. And that is the harshness that you feel in your hand and in your arm. It's also an additional problem for getting back on target. In other words, you're going to have this recoil impulse for the muzzle to want to rise when the slide starts rearward. But this collision that causes that last bit of a jump or a flip, depending on the shooter, that's what we're controlling with the buffering recoil spring guide rod. So when you get to the place where you have the correct recoil spring, and again, hopefully the correct mainspring, and these springs are doing their job, that are much bigger than the buffering spring. When these springs are doing their job, then really the buffering guide rod is really refining and rehoning something that's already working the way that it's supposed to, or already working optimally. Now you are adding another bit of buffering at that last bit where the slide collides with the frame, that final muzzle jump or muzzle flip. It can be reduced or potentially even eliminated, but that can only happen if your slide velocity coming rearward is already being controlled before the slide encounters the buffering recoil spring guide rod. So as a result of what we have been seeing, and of course BHSpringSolutions has no way to have any influence or control over whether or not someone has put in all BHSpringSolutions springs, or whether they all have all of the original springs in their high power. We are now going to include, with the buffering recoil spring guide rod, automatically the correct recoil spring for standard pressure ammunition for your high power with the buffering guide rod. So if you have an FN or Browning high power, or any of the clones except the Kareen Mark II or Mark III, or the Arcus 94 full size, any other ones, the FEGs, the FMs, the Tissos, the Inglis, any of these other clones, you will use the 17-pound recoil spring that's going to come with yours. You Kareen Mark II, Mark III users and Arcus 94 users, you'll get a 15-pound recoil spring. That's recommended for standard pressure ammunition in your high powers. So that's what we have decided to do. We think that this is going to give all owners, even if you don't know what recoil spring necessarily you need, this recoil spring from BHSpringSolutions is going to become a component of the buffering recoil spring guide rod product, and recommended for usage in the instructions, that this buffering guide rod is to be used with this recoil spring. And this is a way for people to be able to, with some kind of predictability or uniformity, be able to appreciate what the buffering guide rod does for you, because you'll be starting out with a fresh recoil spring at least. But we still advocate a complete BHSpringSolutions spring kit and fresh springs all the way around the pistol. Life works better that way. Reliability is always better that way. Performance is better that way. So that's what we're talking about today, is that the buffering recoil spring guide rod will now automatically come with the appropriate recoil spring for the high power it's being purchased for. Thanks for watching, folks. Mark Allen, BHSpringSolutions.com.